Bueno, muy bien, muy buenas noches a todos, muchas gracias a los que ya se conectan, no se imaginan lo emocionados que estamos Alejo y yo. Esta noche estamos con un gran autor de libros, gran inversionista, una persona que es amigo personal de los grandes inversionistas de este planeta. No nos la creemos realmente que podamos estar hablando con el señor William Green esta noche acá en Mis Propias Finanzas. Vamos a ver cómo sale esto. La entrevista va a ser en inglés, por obvias razones. Nos tocará chapucear inglés, nos perdonarán. Mi inglés anda un poquito oxidado, de pronto el de Alejo un poco mejor, pero bueno, ya vemos qué tal sale. Ya tenemos a nuestro invitado de esta noche. Los que de pronto no saben inglés, no entienden inglés, no se preocupen. Mañana mismo vamos a subir la entrevista y la van a poder ver con subtítulos en español. Así que, una vez más, bienvenidos. Muchísimas gracias por conectarse. And here we have our guest tonight, Mr. William Green. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you. I feel a bit guilty that I didn't work harder in high school on my Spanish. I'd be able to speak to you in Spanish, so I apologize for my laziness as a teenager.
No, I apologize in advance for my rusty English. I haven't spoken in English for a long time, so we'll see how this goes. Alejo, welcome.
Es mejor que mi español.
Great, Alejo. Thank you for being here, man. Welcome.
Gracias.
Thank you for the invite, and thank you, William. It's an honor to be here with you. It's a true pleasure, and I hope we enjoy and learn a lot from you, which you're a very knowledgeable person. So we're very excited. I'm proud to be here.
Thanks. I'll do my best.
So, William, you're the author of one of my favorite books that I've read this year about investing and about how to be successful in life in general. So it makes us very happy to have you tonight in the show. Thank you so much for your generosity. And let me tell you about the story and why we're here, because it's pretty funny. With Alejandro, which is a very good friend, a longtime friend, we were at the airport in Omaha this year for the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, and we picked your book. And Alejo told me, hey, you know what, Juan? One day I wish I could speak to William himself. So I'm going to write him a message. Of course, I thought he was crazy. I never thought you were going to answer back. And I think he wrote you on Twitter, I believe, and you answered back, actually. And Alejo was like, holy cow, now what do we do? So here we are. Let's jump right in, because we have...
I try my best to reply. And sometimes I have this terrible feeling because messages come from Twitter and LinkedIn and my email account, and I always know that I'm forgetting something. So I apologize to everyone. Recently I had someone invited me to speak in London, and I looked at this thing. I could not find the invitation anywhere, nowhere. So I'm glad that I replied to you. So thank you. And you have an amazing audience. So I'm happy to be here with you. So thank you.
We have more than let's see, 1,000 people now watching you, listening to what you have to say tonight. So let's jump right in. Let's start by asking you, how did you end up interviewing and actually becoming personal friends with the best investors in the world?
Becoming friends with them is a whole different matter. So that in a way requires a degree of trust that you earn over a long period of time, I think. And it's a complicated subject, actually, because for a journalist, we're not really supposed to become friends with the people we write about. I worked for many years at Time magazine, and I wrote for Forbes and Fortune. And there's this sense within the magazine world that you should be very cool and objective. And I was like that for many years, but I wrote about these people for a long time. So, for example, I would write an article about Bill Miller at a point where he was beating the market for 15 years in a row, right? This is unprecedented. Nobody had ever done this before. And I would go write about him for Fortune magazine. So this would be the days after 9/11, right after the attack on the Twin Towers. And I would spend several days with him, right? I would go on his private plane. He went to his alma mater, the college where he had studied. And he had this private plane that he'd bought partly because he liked to travel with his wolfhound, this enormous dog that was like 110 pounds. And so he needed his own plane. The wolfhound didn't come on our trip. And so I would do things like I would go with someone like that in the days after 9/11 when the market's crashing. And it was, I think the markets were closed for about 5 days in the US. It was the worst week since the Great Depression. And I'm with this guy who's managing tens of billions of dollars. And he's just joyful, calm, placing massive bets on tech stocks as they're melting down. So I would be writing that sort of story in a very intimate, very personal way, but still objective, still trying to stand back and kind of judge it as a regular journalist. But then over many years, I sort of shifted to writing books. And in books, the rules are different. And so then you can kind of, you can write about yourself more, and you can say, you can describe yourself in that situation with them, and you can talk about what you're learning personally. And so over many years, the example of Bill Miller is a good example where I've probably interviewed him for nearly 100 hours over the last 22 years.
Wow.
And so you can imagine the trust that you build up. So say then after, he had this extraordinary performance, and then he kind of melted down during the financial crisis, and he made a terrible analytical mistake. And he went from $77 billion under management to maybe 800 million under management. And 100 people lost their jobs because of mistakes that he made, that they had to leave his company. So it was a terrible period for him. So then when I went back and interviewed him after all these years, I'd written about him several times for Time magazine and Money magazine and Fortune and the like. Then I go back to interview him for a book that I was writing at the time, The Great Minds of Investing, which came before this book. And I'm able to talk to him about the difficulties I'd gone through. So I had lost my job as editor of the European, Middle Eastern, and African edition of Time magazine. And so I was sort of saying to him, look, I feel like I've been publicly shamed, and it's so painful, even though I know it's not personal. I know there's a financial crisis and the magazine industry has been in trouble. I feel like I'm dealing with this public shame. How are you dealing with it? And so you built up this relationship and this trust that's very intimate. And so then when I was writing this book, Richer, Wiser, Happier, and I say to him, I want to spend a lot of time with you. Can I come spend a couple of days with you? He's like, yeah, sure. And then you say, can I come to your home? And he's like, yeah, sure. And so that's many years of intimacy built up. And so at a certain point, it's friendship. I mean, it's a degree of trust, but it's also, it's professional, but at the same time, you know each other, you know what you've been through. And then similarly for something like writing about Monish Pabrai, who's the first chapter of the book, I spent 5 days in India with him. At one point, we were literally sharing a bunk bed on an all-night train ride across India. So you can imagine, I mean, so I'm trying to be objective. I'm trying to be impartial. How can you be impartial when you're sharing a bunk bed with someone? It's a very intimate process. So what you're trying to do, instead of being very detached and objective, what you're trying to do is really tell the truth of who someone is and how they see the world. So there's a degree of intimacy where you're getting inside their head, and you want to honor what you're seeing there. So you want to tell in a deeply truthful way. So it's a different approach to writing. So what I was trying to do in this book is to give the reader a sense of what it's actually like to be inside the mind of someone like Bill Miller or someone like Monish. And so there's a degree of intimacy that I think you could only have if you'd had many years of building up these relationships, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing to be able to tell that. The next thing I wanted to ask you about is something you talk a lot in several places in the book, and is you talk about the power of compounding money, but you put a caveat on that, and it's compounding goodwill, and that that to us is like really interesting. So we would like you to expand on that and tell us about compounding money, but especially compounding goodwill.
Yeah, it's an important question. Thank you for asking. One of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is to say, look, if you just become very rich and you just win the game of investing, but that's all you do with your life, it's a pretty barren life. What does it really add up to? And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, this is how you learn from people like Charlie Munger or Monish Pabrai or Guy Spear or Tom Gaynor, Bill Miller, all of these remarkable thinkers. This is what you can learn from them about how to get rich, but this is what you can learn from them about how to think and how you can actually live more wisely. And one of my favorite examples of this is this idea that came originally, I think, from my friend Guy Spear, who runs a fund called the Aquamarine Fund in Zurich, who's someone I was at Oxford with many years ago, but then we became friends when we were in New York together. And I've invested in his fund for more than 20 years, and I helped him write his autobiography, The Education of a Value Investor. So he's someone I've really spent a great deal of time with over the years. And one of the things that Guy decided very early on in his career, in the early days, he was a classic Harvard Business School graduate who wanted to get rich. He was very ambitious. He'd come top of his class at Oxford in economics. His tutorial partner was David Cameron, who was the British Prime Minister. So and he did better than David Cameron at school. So he was a very clever boy. And so he was a very ambitious guy, wanted to become rich, wanted to become successful. And then, and so in the early days, he read things like Robert Cialdini's book on, which I guess it was probably Persuasion, one of those books. I'm probably getting the title wrong. And there was this idea that if, I guess it's called reciprocation, that if you behave decently to someone, they're going to reciprocate. And so Guy starts to do these crazy things like sending letters to people, sending 3 thank you letters every day to people. And he starts to do lots of favors to people. And initially, he thinks, this is great. This is going to make me more successful because all these people are going to want to reciprocate. They're going to be kind back to me. And then what he found, which is this great irony, is that it actually made him happier and happier. Because so he became kind of addicted to the good feelings that came from being decent to people. And so it kind of became self-fulfilling. So he actually became the person that he was pretending to be. He became kinder and kinder. And what happens is you just see this enormous number of people around the world actually wanting to help Guy because he's helped so many people. And so I've been the recipient of his generosity so many times myself. And so one of the things that happens is, for example, I edit his annual report. And there's no way I would do that in the middle of my deadline to finish my book when everything was going crazy for me. I'm like, really, I'm going to haul off and spend several days working on Guy's book. But because he's a really close friend who's been very kind to me, I would do things like that for him. And so there's a kind of profound truth here that he had tapped into, which is that when you go through your life trying to help people, you draw an extraordinary group of people into your life. So for one thing, you have this amazing ecosystem of people who want to help you. And what became obvious to me, I could see that someone like Warren Buffett was doing the same thing to Guy. So for example, sometimes a Guy would send me an email, for example, where he had a copy of a letter that Buffett had written to him saying, your annual report is fantastic. It's one of the best annual reports I've ever seen. And your shareholders must be really happy to be in your fund. And Guy's like, why would he do that? And I'm like, because it's kind. He gets nothing at all out of it, but it makes a huge difference to you. It like makes your year, basically. And I saw the same thing with Monish Pabrai, where, again, Warren Buffett sent a letter to Monish a few months ago, telling him that his charitable foundation, Dakshana, which is extraordinary, said it's just the most incredible thing. And he said, there are very few CEOs or philanthropists or anything who've matched what you do. And he said, I'm proud just to be named in your annual report. And again, just so it's a few minutes of Warren's time, but for Monish, it changes his life. It makes him want to be a better and better person. It's like his hero patting him on the back and lifting him up. And so when you see people like Warren Buffett behaving that way, Charlie Munger behaving that way, Monish Pabrai, Guy Spear behaving that way, you start to look at it and you say, why? Why does it work? And so one of the things that Charlie Munger says is take a good idea and take it seriously. And so when you see a good idea like compounding goodwill, you want to take it seriously. You want to say, well, wait a second. So there's one model of living and operating in the world, which is what we see on Succession or Billions, right? Where it's like, I'm gonna crush this guy on the way up. I'm gonna sue my partner. I'm gonna sleep with my partner's wife. I'm gonna steal. I'm gonna overcharge my shareholders. Whatever you can get away with. And then there are these other guys like Buffett and Munger who are not naive. They're incredibly smart, and they've adopted this different model of compounding goodwill. And I think when you look at that, you have to start to say, well, maybe there's a different way to operate. And it might seem naive in the short term because sometimes you're going to get taken advantage of by people because they'll think that you're a pushover or something. But in my experience, the more I try to be decent, the better my life has become. And so this has been one of the things where, and I'm not saying this in a self-congratulatory way because I still do tons of stupid and dumb and unpleasant things and lose my temper, especially when I'm hungry. But if in general I make it a rule that I'm going to try to become kinder and nicer, there's this kind of compounding of goodwill that's extraordinarily powerful, and it has so many benefits to it. For one thing, you feel better about yourself. You draw better people into your life. People want to help you, and I saw it recently with Tom Gaynor, who I write about in that chapter, who on where I mentioned this idea of compounding goodwill. It's a chapter on high performance habits. And I asked Tom recently if he would come to an event where I wanted to interview him at a private event in New York. And he ended up, he said, so there's nothing in it at all for him, basically. And he ends up, this is a guy who's a co-CEO of a Fortune 400 company. And it turned out he took a train for 6 hours to come to this meeting so that I could interview him for an hour at a private event. And then the next, few hours later, he gets a train back. And I just thought, what an incredible human being. And when you see someone behave like that, it makes you want to be better yourself. And it also means, what wouldn't I do to try to help him? So I think it's very wise. It's one of those things that for our audience, it's actually really easy to replicate. Sure. So nothing I can do will make me as clever as Buffett or Munger. I'm doomed to be stupid in comparison, but I can try to replicate that. And so that's a very, very helpful thing that we can clone. And this is the point in the first chapter of the book is Monish has built his life around ideas that you can clone, that you can replicate or mimic from other people. I don't know how you translate clone in Spanish.
Clonar.
Oh, is that right?
But yeah, you've learned the lesson because here you are talking to us, and probably you have nothing to gain from this conversation, but your generosity is about giving back, and we thank you for that. Let's talk about Charlie Munger, William, because you said that when you had the chance to interview Charlie, you were in the presence of greatness. And Charlie says that if all you do in life is accumulate small pieces of paper, that's a failed life. So can you expand on first your interaction with Charlie Munger, one of the greatest of all times, and his idea of if you just accumulate money, it's a failed life?
Yeah, Charlie, for people who don't really know much about him, he's now 98 years old, and he's a total polymath. He knows everything about everything, except for the literature. He's not a great literature buff, but he's a real polymath about science and history and math. And he's taken ideas from all of these different areas to become kind of this thinking machine. He's just a brilliant guy. Monish, who's very close to Charlie, says that Charlie is a quantum leap above Warren in terms of intelligence. So you can imagine when I was trying to set up this book and I was asking for lots of interviews from famous people, there was a moment, I remember it very vividly, where I was standing outside my kitchen in my house, just about 10 feet away from where I am now. And I guess I get this email from Charlie's assistant saying, yes, he'll give you an interview, but he'll give you like 10 minutes, basically. And I'm like, yes. I mean, it's one of those ecstatic moments in your life where you're like, okay, I've got Munger. But this is the craziest thing, because here I was traveling 3,000 miles from New York to Los Angeles for a 10-minute interview. So I'm pretty nutty in the way that I prepare for anything. So I spent probably a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, maybe. I can't even remember. I mean, I just ridiculously prepared, reading everything that he'd ever written or said, preparing my questions. And so when I went in, so he agreed to meet me before the annual meeting of the Daily Journal Company, which is a company in Los Angeles that he was then the chairman of. And so I knew that he would be in this particular room in the lobby before the meeting. So I showed up an hour before our meeting on the off chance that I would get more time with him. And I just wait outside this room, and it's kind of crowded. The lobby's filling up. And then he's having this kind of board meeting, I guess, in that room. And everyone is coming out. And I go in, and I'm sitting there kind of knee to knee with this legendary old guy who's got terrible eyesight. Like he's almost blind in one eye, and the other eye is glass. And he's got these very thick glasses. And I'm sitting with my knees virtually touching his knees. And there are people crowding out of the room, and he doesn't notice any of the noise around him. Like he's totally zoned in. And because I didn't have very much time, I cut straight to the chase. So this is the opposite of with someone like Bill Miller, where I had 2.5 days, or Monish, where I had 5 days. Here I have 10 minutes. So the very first thing I say is, I regard you as the grand master of stupidity reduction. And why is it? Why is that the approach you take? Because what I'd realized in reading through so much of what Munger has thought and said and done over the years is that here you have this guy who's one of the cleverest people in the world. And yet what he's really focusing on systematically is reducing what he calls standard stupidities. And this, again, this is an incredibly profound and practical idea that's very helpful in investing, but it's also incredibly helpful in life. And this is totally clonable. This is something where, again, we may not be even within 50 IQ points of Charlie, but you can go through your life systematically reducing standard stupidities. And one of the things that he does to do this is he says, okay, let me collect examples of really stupid things that people do that mess them up in life. So in investing, for example, what he uses this process called inversion, which comes from a 19th century mathematician called Carl Gustav Jacobi, who said invert, always invert. So you solve the answer backwards. So what you say is, if I want to become a good investor, let me figure out first how to be a terrible investor. So for our audience, you think of the things that the really terrible investors you know have done. And that includes all of us, right? Because we've all done incredibly stupid things. So you trade too much. You buy things that you don't understand, investments, assets that you don't understand, where you haven't done due diligence. You stray outside your circle of competence, as Buffett would put it. You don't keep an eye on expenses. So you rack up big trading costs. You rack up big tax bills because you're trading in and out. You buy, one of the things Munger said people do all of the time, they buy something that's cyclical, a stock that's cyclical at the top of the cycle, assuming that the good times are going to continue, and then it turns and you get left holding the bag. And he said, look, Wall Street will sell you any crap that they can get a commission for, a fee for. So So you partner with people who are untrustworthy. So think about if you're trying to buy a fund, you could literally say, okay, what would a terrible fund look like? Okay, it's going to be loaded with fees. It's going to be in the hottest asset class that everyone thinks is going to continue to be hot, but we know is going to crash sooner or later and regress to the mean. So it's an incredibly effective way to think about avoiding disaster. And Munger would apply this in other areas of life. So if you're going to get married, for example, you say, what would make the marriage a disaster? So you think, well, if I'm unfaithful, well, what about if I lie, if I never tell the truth to my wife, or whatever it might be? Or what about if you wanted to, be a lousy parent? You think about, before you think about how to be a good parent, you think, well, let me look at my relatives or my friends who've been really terrible parents. Well, let me shout at my kid more. Let me criticize my kid constantly so the kid has no confidence at all, right? So you're constantly inverting. And the reason this is so effective is that Munger says, well, it's easier to figure out what not to do than what to do. And so you want to solve the problem both ways, right? If you don't just want to invert, you want to also figure out, well, how can I be a good father? How can I be a good husband? How can I be a good friend? How can I be a good business partner? But it's very helpful to solve it both ways, to figure out how to be bad. And so when, for example, I said so I ended up getting quite a bit more time than 10 minutes in the end, because I stayed on after the daily journal meeting and kept asking questions when he had this sort of group of people around him. And one of the things I said to Munger then is, what can we learn from you and Warren about how to have a happy life? And he said, he immediately starts talking about relationships. And he says, I've been a good partner to Warren. He's been a marvelous partner to me. And he starts talking about how we have a simple model. And he says, if you want to have a good partner, be a good partner. And so you think of something like that. That's a distillation of wisdom from a guy who at the time was probably 93 years old when I asked him that. Who's had a 50-year relationship with Buffett that's been extraordinary. And he says a similar thing about marriage. He says, if you want to have a good wife, if you want to deserve one. And it's such an interesting, such a practical piece of advice. So what I'm looking for from these great investors is ways of thinking that work in markets and work in life. And so this one idea of reducing standard stupidities, think about if you go through your life trying to work out all of the dumb things not to do. And what you really want to do, that I think is very distinctive to the greatest investors, is you want to avoid situations where there's limited upside, but the downside can be catastrophic, right? So if you're going to make a mistake, you want to make sure that it's non-fatal. This is something that Jeff Gundlach, who's often called the king of bonds, said to me: make sure your mistakes are non-fatal. And that goes for investing and life, right? So, I ended up, I had like a 2-hour Zoom breakfast with Charlie Munger last year with a few other famous investors, and they wanted to talk about the book because Charlie had decided that he loved the book, and I could see that Charlie had bought Alibaba, and I'm like, oh, that's great. So I know that Charlie, one of the greatest investors of all time, has bought this Chinese stock. So I ended up, a few days later, I buy Alibaba. So I'm now down 53% since then. but it's not a disaster because I didn't put that much in it, right? So that's the sort of thing where you want to set your life up so when you screw up, it's not going to kill you, right? So you avoid things like driving when you're drunk. You avoid driving without a seatbelt. Think about situations where the downside is catastrophic. Think about things like cheating on your taxes or lying to your boss, like these things where it's like, yeah, there's a limited upside, but the downside can be really catastrophic.
Well, let me tell you, there's someone else in this interview that is 50% down for buying Alibaba after Charlie Munger did the same thing. So Alejo, go ahead with your question.
Maybe we'll be all right in the end.
Yeah, no, I did the same than you, but I did put a lot of my portfolio in Alibaba, and Yeah, I mean it hasn't gone well, but I guess I keep it there to learn that I'm sharing my losses with Charlie.
Well, one of the things that I do, Alejandro, is I've said to I've said to myself, I'm going to try to hold these investments for 5 years. Whenever I buy something, it's a 5-year purchase. And so I don't own many stocks, right? I own funds mainly. I only own 3 individual stocks. And so my hands are tied. So if I've made a mistake, okay, but I'm giving it time to work out. And so what I'm trying to do by holding things for 5 years is just to say, let me do less. And so every time I look at my portfolio and I'm like, Jesus, I'm down 53%. Really? Maybe I should just sell this so I don't have to look at this bloody thing every day. I'm like, no, 5 years, not allowed to. And who knows whether I'll do it. And but I also own Seritage Growth Properties, which is something I cloned from Monish. And Seritage initially doubles, and then it crashes, and I was down half, and now suddenly it's surging again. And I'm like, and Monish has already sold it, but I'm like, no, I can't sell it because I need to own it for 5 years. So I'm just trying to do less because I know that the more I do, the more stupid mistakes I'm going to make.
Yeah, your friend Guy is the king of doing nothing, right?
Guy is
Yeah.
unbelievably patient. So when Guy was buying Berkshire Hathaway in about 1999, 2000, when everybody already was saying Buffett was too old to touch. And 22 years later, he still owns it and he won't sell it. And, it just keeps doing fine. And so that's part of why I'm in his fund. I'm not saying this as an advertisement. It's like he's more patient than I am. And so because I know that I don't have a very good temperament, I'm outsourcing to him because he has a better temperament than I do.
That's really smart. So I'm going to go with my next question. And it is, during the book, you always say that value investors are always working on themselves, which is really, really interesting because you think these billionaires are perfect and happy. But as you mentioned, tell us true stories about their life. You say they are always working on themselves. So we would like to hear a couple of examples. You pointed out in the book, and I would like everybody here to read that wonderful book, but you can give us a little.
Well, one of my favorite examples is the person I end the book with, Arnold Vandenberg, who I describe as in many ways the most successful human being I've encountered in the investment world. And so Arnold literally said to me at one point, I'm going to be working on myself until the day that I die. And Arnold must be probably 81, 82 at the moment. And he's still, I haven't talked to him for a few weeks, but Arnold, every time I talk to him, he's excited about some new discovery he's made about the subconscious mind. Or when I went and spent the first 2 things I did when I reported this book, where I went for 5 days to India with Monish, and I went to spend 2.5 days with Arnold Vandenberg in Texas. And Arnold, who must have been about 77 at the time, literally would show me how he could take the bookshelf and put his foot above his head on the bookshelf because he'd been doing so much yoga. And so here's this guy, I can barely touch my knees, let alone my toes. And here's this guy who at almost 80 can put his foot above his head. And he shows me he could do that yoga move where I don't know, I'll make up some title, but it'll be wrong. Where, you put your hands down like that, and then you do, your legs are crossed above your hands. So you're holding yourself in lotus position off the ground on top of your hands. And he's doing this at like 78. And so that's an extraordinary thing. So that's a guy who's constantly working on himself. And one of the reasons why, and actually while I was interviewing him, he's sitting there eating. He didn't eat until the mid-afternoon. And when he finally ate, it was basically just sort of shakes with, like beets or some horrible thing in it. So he was trying to get back down to like 155 pounds or whatever, because that was the weight he'd been when he was at like 30 or something like that. So you had about 5 pounds, and I'm, here I am, I'm drifting north of 200, and I'm feeling totally ashamed. And so that's really inspiring, because you see someone who just is constantly trying to get better. And I do think that's this chapter, High Performance Habits, that I would encourage people to look at. There's something very profound about what people like Tom Gaynor are doing, where they're talking about it's about dogged incremental progress over time. So you're picking these habits that they seem like nothing on the day, right? Like, what does it really matter that Arnold eats, this crappy shake with, carrots and beets and stuff, instead of having, ice cream? On the day, it doesn't really matter. But if you pick habits, just as we were saying, the compounding of goodwill, you want to pick habits whose benefits compound over time. And so you can do this with diet, you can do it with exercise, you can do it with meditation. And meditation is a really profound example of it. And a lot of the great investors meditate, because a lot of the benefits of meditation, I'm no great expert, although I do try to meditate regularly. A lot of the benefits you seem to be able to get from 12 minutes a day, something like that. So you're, obviously you get more benefit the more you do. But I think what you want to do in life is pick a bunch of habits whose benefits are going to compound over time, and then just stick at it. And so Tom Gaynor, who I write about in that chapter, he's taking very much the same approach with investing as he is with exercise and diet. What he's saying is, I need to be directionally correct. I don't need to be perfect. And so what he says is that people who are very extreme tend not to be resilient, right? So you decide, I'm going to lose 50 pounds. And it's like, no, that's not going to work. And so he was like, I'm going to lose 1 pound a year for 10 years. And because most middle-aged men put on 1 pound or 2 every year, I outperform on this front. This is one of the few fronts where I always outperform. If you can lose 1 or 2 pounds a year over 10 years, it's a tremendous advantage. And this seems like an irrelevant example. And people in the crowd are probably like, I wanted to hear about making money. But actually, it's a really good metaphor for how to approach investing. And so what Tom Gaynor has done is he's taken what he calls a radically moderate approach to investing. And so he owns probably about 100 stocks, but most of the money is in the top 10 or 20. And so again, it's like somewhere, it's balanced between being concentrated and diversified. It's not crazy. It's not crazily extreme. If he makes mistakes, he's going to be okay. But it's not so diversified that he can't outperform. And so it's a very similar approach to the way that he approaches exercise and diet. And it happens to suit his temperament. And so I think as you go through life, you just pick a bunch of habits that you're like, yeah, I can see I can stick with this one. And then you look back 10, 15, 20 years later, and these small incremental differences over time became overwhelming. And so what Tom said to me is, he said, I was never the best at anything. He said, I was never the best investor. I was never the smartest investor. But he said, when I look back after 30 years, he said, you become number one-ish, just about number one, because so many other people fell by the wayside. And so this is like a really profound insight for me. And so I have a 21-year-old daughter and a 24-year-old son, and I'm constantly using the phrase directionally correct. It's like, you want to do things that are directionally correct. And this is something I've stolen absolutely from Tom Gaynor, because you're often doing things in your life where you're like, I don't know if this is the optimal thing. I don't know, but you're like, it's fine. It's directionally correct. And if you just keep plugging away in that direction. So is it the best type of exercise? Is it the best type of diet? Is it the best way to invest? No, probably not. But if it's directionally correct and you sustain it over time, you'll do great. So the key really in investing in life, I think, or one of the keys, is not to get blown out of the game. You want to avoid catastrophe. And so all of these great investors, they've sustained their performance over many years, right? They've had disasters along the way or terrible disappointments along the way, but they've stayed in the game despite their mistakes and despite the difficult periods. And so it's the same path as this steady incremental progress with diet, exercise, meditation. So one of the things that was very strange to me in writing the book was I had this sense that there was that the principles that work in investing work in other areas of life. And what was extraordinary was the more I tested that hypothesis by talking to these people about how they led their lives, the more you saw these tremendous consistencies. And so that was the reason why I started that chapter, High Performance Habits, by writing about Tom Gaynor's diet, because it's a perfect metaphor. It's dogged incremental progress over time.
That's amazing. And of all those strategies and habits, which ones do you apply most to your life, William?
Both I fail at all of them, repeatedly. I tell you, one of the things that I repeat very, very often to my kids is something that I learned from a meditation teacher called Sharon Salzberg, who talks about when you mess up, like she talks about it again in the context of meditation, where you're trying to focus on the breath and then you realize, oh, I totally lost concentration because my mind's all over the place. And she says, let go with self-compassion and begin again. And that's something I think about the whole time, because with all of these practices, here I am, I'm writing this book telling people, oh, I've learned all of this stuff from some of the greatest minds of all time. And I'm constantly screwing up. I'm constantly doing stupid stuff. And so the ability, when you screw up, when you fall off the path, I didn't exercise today. I didn't exercise yesterday, but I did eat ice cream. And so then the ability to say, all right, we'll let go with self-compassion and begin again. And so it's recognizing that we're human and we're deeply flawed. And so it's not saying, I'm going to be perfect, I'm going to be optimal, but it's having the strength to recover from your mistakes is critical. And that's something that I think about a great deal, because, and I read a lot about Nick Sleep, who's a remarkable person. I was emailing with him last week, and he said something in an email just in passing that I didn't even really think about much, where he talked about how important self-forgiveness is. That's really interesting. Like, here's this guy who seems sort of perfect in so many ways, and it's like, yeah, he's got to practice self-forgiveness as well, and I do as well. So, I mean, so I'm not really answering your question about what I adopt, but in a sense, is my failure to adopt a lot of this stuff. It's the fact that I'm so, despite how much I've learned from these people, and despite how much I really do act on what they've taught me, I'm messing up the whole time. And so the ability to let go and begin again with self-compassion is, I think, a profoundly important ability, because it's, if you just are beating yourself up, you can get a great deal done in life. I mean, you can be very successful, but it makes you a little bit fragile, right? It's not resilient. At a certain point, you get tired. And I can say this, having used this approach many years on myself, and I still do to a great extent. But at a certain point, it's like it's too hard to beat yourself up the whole time. And so I'm trying to coax myself towards a gentler, more self-forgiving, more self-compassionate approach. And as my wife would tell you, I'm failing miserably because I'm constantly beating myself up and trying to push myself, and I but we're each wired a certain way. We're very idiosyncratic, and so part of what I see with the greatest investors is that they're harnessing their own idiosyncrasy, their own craziness, right? So you have to be true to yourself, right? So if you're a little bit crazy in a certain way, that ends up being an advantage. And so I don't know. I mean, look at my crazy bookshelf back here. That's a pretty good reflection of my life, right? It's like, and if I showed you this, I don't know if I point this down, it's like there are more books on the floor because I've run out of space, and then there are more books at the top because I've run out of space. And so it's like I can't help myself. And I've got more over here. I'm constantly trying to sort of ingest more ideas, more information, more knowledge, and so I have to kind of harness my own particular form of craziness. And so it's you do need to be true to yourself in a deep sense. You're trying to clone these people who figured out things that really work, and at the same time you're trying to do the opposite thing and be true to yourself, because life isn't simple, right? It's paradoxical. And so you want to learn from people like Munger and Buffett and say, yeah, let me do this thing that Munger does, where he tries to be less stupid. But then you also need to look at yourself and say, yeah, and I'm stupid the whole time. And I have to live with that, and I have to treat myself with compassion. I have to recover from it, and I have to try to do better again.
Very, very interesting. I'm gonna ask you the next question is, could you talk about that experience you had with Sir Templeton and his self-discipline, which I think it was super interesting in the book?
Yeah, so John Templeton was a famous he was a legendary investor who in many ways was the most successful global investor of the 20th century. And I went to interview him in the Bahamas when he must have been maybe just short of turning 87, a couple of weeks before his 87th birthday. And I spent pretty much a whole day with him in the Bahamas. I went to his house, and I went to his office and stuff. And he was kind of regarded as this saintly figure, right? He was not only a very, very smart investor, but he was very religious. He was very kind of pious, and it was, you look on his wall and it has things like, it would say an award for Churchman of the Year. And I was kind of at the time not very into religion. Like I was kind of somewhere between agnostic and atheistic. And now I'm much more spiritual. So you can tell I've been wrong, whatever my views, because I've had all of the views. So at some point I've been wrong. But so I'm looking at this guy and I'm like, there's something very severe about him. Like he was very charming and very courteous and gentlemanly, but at the same time, there's something very tough about him. And I look at this and I'm like, yeah, he's sort of a little bit of a hypocrite, I think. And it's not, so I didn't really warm to him. And so I look back, so I wrote a profile of him maybe 20 years ago. And I look back after all these years and I'm like, what did I fail to understand? Like, why was I so judgmental of him? What did I miss because I was so busy judging him? And I write about this at length in that chapter, which is called The Willingness to be Lonely. But one of the most important things that I realized is that I was kind of blinded by my own prejudice. And so I guess what I gradually discovered is that he had amazing control over his own emotions, his own thoughts, his time, his money. And his first wife had died in a motorcycle accident when they'd been on vacation together, and left him with 3 young children to raise on his own. And I just was thinking, maybe, he'd been through so much tragedy and so much pain that he had to take control of his internal life, his mind, his thoughts, in order to survive. And so there was something very tough about him that I didn't like, very austere, very severe. And at the same time, something incredibly admirable. And so as I was writing the chapter, I'm sort of confessing the fact that, well, the reason I was so uneasy about him, the reason why I found him so tough, was because it exposed how weak I was in all of these different areas. And I could see, well, so here I am, my mind is all over the place. My thoughts are uncontrolled. I don't have control over my time. not exercising consistently like him. Like he would go in the ocean, he would pump his arms and legs in the ocean for 45 minutes a day. He would save half of his money, even when he was very young. And, he would talk about giving away something like $10 for every dollar he spent on himself, or $20 for every dollar he spent on himself. And so I wasn't in control of my finances, my time, my emotions. And so in a way, it was admitting the fact that there were things in him that made me very uncomfortable, but that I needed to be more like him. And so there's something very, it's a real challenge when you're writing a book. You're having to decide, should I present myself to the reader as someone who's a wise man who's figured it all out? Or should I just say, yeah, I'm an idiot on this journey with the rest of you, trying to figure it out, groping in the dark? And I, at a certain point, just decided, I'm just going to try to be truthful. And if there's something that's embarrassing to me, all right, I'll admit it. And so because I don't want to present myself as some sort of sage. I want to present myself as somebody who's trying to learn from these really smart, really thoughtful people. And so it's kind of my journey. It's not just as on this conversation, I'm not trying to tell you, look, I've figured it all out, I'm a genius. I'd rather tell you about my investment that didn't work out rather than my investment that did. And I think that's something also that I learned from Munger, where Munger says he likes people who rub their nose in their mistakes. And he says he said, I like people who admit that they're complete horses' asses. And I think the reason why he likes that is that if you admit that you've messed up, you're much more likely to learn from your mistake. And so next time I'm inclined to do something really stupid, if I've already admitted publicly to having made the same mistake, maybe I'll think twice. And so I don't know. I think it's also, I see people like Monish Pabrai and Guy Spear trying to be incredibly honest. And that's, I mean, that maybe that's also a reply to a question you asked before about something that I'm trying to clone more. In my podcast, I started a Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast, and I interviewed Monish for that recently. And I talked to him at some length about this idea of being truthful, and also to Guy Spear in the interview that I did with him. I think that's an extraordinarily interesting experiment that Monish has been really undertaking for the last 20 or so years, probably, where he's just decided he's going to try to be more and more honest, more and more truthful. And it's kind of extraordinary what's happened in his life as he's just become more and more truthful. Like I'm not trying to hold him up as some sort of sage or saint or anything. I'm sure he screws up and does things that he wouldn't be proud of as well. But sure. I mean, someone like Munger really, really wants to be in Monish's life. That's a very interesting thing. And so that's a reflection of the quality of the human being, not just the intellect. Well, he's got a very big intellect. He's a very smart guy, Monish. And so that's something that I'm interested, again, like compounding goodwill. I fail on this front the whole time, but I'm trying to be more truthful because I think it's kind of powerful. If you think about all of the people in the world who are so clearly out for themselves, lying, spinning, self-aggrandizing, trying to make themselves look better than they are. I think I spent so much of my youth doing that, trying to make myself, I would be mean to someone because it would make, or not mean, but I would joke at their expense to make myself feel better. Sure. I try less to do that sort of thing now. And so I'd rather highlight my own failings and try to be honest. And that's something that, again, is very clonable from people like Monish, and it's a very powerful idea, along with something like compounding goodwill and avoiding standard stupidities. It's a very powerful master principle in life to try to become more truthful, and that's something that Monish got directly from this book, Power versus Force by David Hawkins. So I would encourage your listeners to check that out. It's a very interesting book, strange but interesting.
So you're not perfect, but at least you're trying to be directionally correct, as Tom Gaynor says, right?
Yeah, and trying not to lose hope as well, because I sometimes look at myself and I'm like, really, still such a schmuck, and then it's very easy to despair. And so I think, to try to keep going, to try to keep plugging away, to try to keep improving. There's a guy I write about in the book, who is a remarkable person who says a lot of life is about surviving the dips, and that's a very important phrase to me. Like you want to position yourself in life so that you can survive the dips. So there are these periods, right? There are these periods where you're going along like this and everything's good, or you're going like this and then it goes like that. And the point is, over the long term, if you can survive the dips, if you can avoid catastrophe, if you can keep plugging away, keep being directionally correct, keep trying to be kinder, keep trying to learn, keep being a learning machine like Buffett and Munger, constantly learn from your mistakes, avoid terrible stupidity. You can make a hell of a lot of mistakes along the way, and it'll still turn out okay. It'll still turn out well.
William, Alejandro won't forgive me if I don't ask you about Lilu, which is one of his idols.
Yeah, sure. What would you like to know?
Alejo, go ahead.
No, I mean, I would like to. I know you spent a late night with him in Omaha and kind of like talk about him. I mean, I do admire him a lot, but he's not really public. He just published it.
Yeah, which is frustrating. And if I'm honest about it, when I was working on the book, I went to interview him and I spent time with him, and he was like, yeah, I can't talk publicly. And so I had made a trip to go see him in Pasadena to talk. So I've talked to him a bunch of times, and he's incredibly impressive. I mean, he's a really, really smart guy. The best place to learn, well, he wrote an autobiography that's interesting, but that's old. And so it's sort of about his early years, because he was one of the leaders in Tiananmen Square. I think he was in charge of communications among the rebels in Tiananmen Square. So a very brave guy going up against the Chinese government. But one of the best places you can learn about him is in the podcast where I interviewed Monish Pabrai recently, because Monish talks at length about Lilu, who's a close friend of his. And one of the stories that Monish told in that episode, I don't know if you got to listen to it yet, Alejandro.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so for your audience who hasn't heard this, I was asking him, how did Charlie Munger figure out how smart Lilu is? Because Charlie Munger gave a portion of his money, I think it was something like $50 million many years ago, that Lilu has turned into billions, right? I mean, or hundreds of millions. I mean, Lilu's been extraordinarily successful, and he's a billionaire in his own right. And Monish said to me that when Lilu was at Columbia University, having come to America barely, English wasn't his first language, right? And he's sleeping in a house with like 8 people or something like that, and he's doing 3 degrees simultaneously, I think. I mean, he's a brilliant guy. He would get money from, I only know this through Monish, so I assume it's true, but he would get money from Columbia, scholarship money. And before the bill was due, he would start trading the money in the stock market. And so according to Monish, he'd already made $1 million by the time he graduated from Columbia using Columbia's money. Now, who knows if this is true, but it's in a way, it's too good to check. But so that was one of the reasons why Munger thought, yeah, this guy's really smart.
Wow.
And Lilu, one of the things that's interesting about Lilu is he's got his ego under control in an interesting way. And so I mean, all of these people have egos, right? They're all, they're formidable characters and they know how smart they are. But I think it's interesting that Li Lu doesn't speak publicly. So he and I have talked about, me doing something about it. And I assume that sooner or later, maybe it'll happen. But, it's a long process of gaining trust. But I think it's interesting. At a certain point, part of my argument is at a certain point, it becomes your responsibility, and not your responsibility, but it becomes a really positive thing to be able to share your wisdom with other people. And my thinking with someone like Li Lu is he doesn't need to be private anymore in sharing his wisdom. It's not like anyone can compete with him anyway. But it's interesting how private some of these people are. If your ego is under control and you don't need the world to say how brilliant you are, it's a competitive advantage, right? Because so I'm sort of torn, because on the one hand, as a journalist, I want people to talk to me. And on the other hand, I think there are cases in which it's pretty good to be quiet and not to let the publicity get to you. But I think as you get older, you get to a point where you want to start to share what you've learned, and that becomes a kind of responsibility. And so part of what I was trying to do in the book is to say, let me synthesize all of the most important things that these great investors have learned, not only about investing, but life. And so part of what I was doing was saying, well, so I don't want to write about investors who are assholes. Like, because if all, sorry, apologies for my language, but if all they've done is figure out how to become extraordinarily rich, but they've left a trail of hatred and anger and jealousy and resentment, I'd spend so long writing, it takes me so long to write. I don't want to spend 5 months working on a chapter with a person like that in my head. But B, what can we really learn from them? I mean, how to have an unsuccessful life. So what I was trying to do is say, when you look at someone like a Charlie Munger, for example, what's impressive, the reason to go back to what you were asking before about me saying today I've been in the presence of greatness, which is how I finished that chapter, there's something mighty about Charlie that goes beyond the fact that he's brilliantly clever, and beyond the fact that he has this great ability to reduce standard stupidities. And one of the things that's great about him, that's truly great actually, is the incredible resilience of the man. And so what I was trying to say is, here's this guy, you think of him as this immense success, but in fact, who's had this straight upward trajectory, but his first child died of leukemia, and his marriage ended in divorce, and he had tons of debt from, healthcare bills for that kid. And, his life was not working out. And so he had to survive the dips. He had to recover from tremendous adversity to build a successful life. And so part of what I was writing about at the end of that chapter was all of the things he'd gone through. He'd gone through losing his second wife. He'd gone through losing his eye. And here he was, this old, infirm guy. And, I describe him kind of trying to get off the stage at the end of this daily journal meeting. And I held his arm as he's getting off the stage, and he's hobbling. I mean, he's this old guy in pain, and is then probably 93. And yet I'd seen him just spend something like 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours, 4 hours, I think, just answering questions nonstop from these people. And one of the things, so probably a couple of hours during the daily journal meeting, but then he'd stayed afterwards. And so people kept asking questions. And so I'm sort of standing there next to the stage while he's answering all these questions from these disciples. And I'm thinking, here's this guy who has a reputation for being rude, abrupt, telling it like it is, not suffering fools gladly. And what I saw was this incredible kindness and generosity of spirit. And I didn't write this in the book, but actually what I really saw is love. What I really see is a guy who keeps sharing ideas and advice. There was a moment where there was sort of a pause as these disciples around the table are asking him for advice, and he says something like, "You guys are going to be okay. You'll be fine." And he's it's like he wants to keep going because he's just trying to impart more knowledge and more wisdom and more insight to help them. And there's nothing in it for him. I mean, maybe there's some psychic benefit, the joy of having people revere you. But it was just kind. It was just generous. And what I was sort of thinking is, well, so here's a guy who probably was deeply flawed in terms of his being rude and abrupt and telling people things that they maybe didn't want to hear, and funny. I mean, really funny.
Like he said to Bill Miller, "Who the hell are you?"
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, he was tough. He's rude, and yet he's become gentler and kinder over the years and softer. And maybe I'm imagining this, and maybe I'm projecting stuff. But I don't think so. And I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking, here's a man who's improved. And then I look at Buffett, and I see the way Buffett behaved at the last annual meeting in Omaha. And I see him saying, if you've done well in life, you should be a better person in the second half of your life than in the first half of your life. And to me, it felt like what he was really saying. It was like he was making a confession that I screwed up in all of these ways. Maybe I neglected my family. I don't know. Maybe I wasn't as good a father as I could have been. Maybe I wasn't as attentive to my wife, But I can see the amount of time and energy he's putting into being kind to my friends and trying to impart advice and be a decent human being and philanthropic and the like. And I'm not trying to idealize these people because they're all flawed in their own way, just as we are. But when you see people becoming better, you're like, that's interesting. That's something I want to clone. And I see the same thing when I look at Guy Spear and Monish Pabrai. I see these two people who are like, that's interesting. I can see Monish is becoming a better person. That's really interesting. And so that's very inspiring for me. And so that's something that's continued since I've written the book, where I can see that in these people, that they're trying to be better. That's interesting. When you have people in their 80s and 90s trying to be better, that gives us hope, right?
That's incredible. William, we would like to end this interview with short answer questions. So
good luck. Have I ever managed to keep anything short?
We appreciate your time, and you've been very generous with us. What's the one book that can change people's lives? Besides yours, of course.
Well, I mean, it's so personal for everyone. And it would definitely be a spiritual book rather than a financial book. And so, I mean, for me, if I'm honest about it, and I'm always wary of this because I don't want to sound like I'm proselytizing, but I mean, on my desk, I have the Zohar, and so when we were starting, that's what I'm like, as we're doing the countdown, that's what I'm reading. And it's an old book in Aramaic. There is a translation of it. It's in 23 volumes, and it's mystifying, and you can't really understand it often, usually. But I feel like you're tapping into something beyond what's rational, beyond what's just logical, and beyond just here in this world. And so I think whatever it is that gets you in that space, maybe it's studying the Stoics, maybe it's studying, I spent a lot of time studying Tibetan Buddhism. I don't think it really matters, but what the path is you take. But for me, I'm slightly uncomfortable saying this because I spend so much time writing about these highly rational people, right? The world's most rational thinkers. But there's some, I think the deepest truth tends to be not so rational. It's more intuitive. It's more, and it's funny when I talk to people like Howard Marks. There was a moment where I was interviewing him, and he's a brilliant guy who seems kind of like a very powerful computer, and I remember him saying, talking to me about just how much he relies on intuition. as an investor. I think that's a very interesting insight. There are things that are, you want to use your brain in a very rational way to maximize your odds of success. But then for me, at least, there's a point where I just sort of let go and I'm like, I don't know, it's not up to me anyway. And I sometimes think that Sir John Templeton is up there in the upper world looking down, laughing at me, saying, yeah, you idiot. That was what I was trying to tell you 20 years ago. But I think we all sort of stumble through, and there are times I don't know. It's interesting. I was interviewing Daniel Goleman, who wrote the Emotional Intelligence book, which sold like 5 million copies. And I was interviewing him on my podcast. It came out a couple of weeks ago, I think. And when I asked him at the end what he wanted his legacy to be, he was saying, I want people to work on their spiritual lives more, to pay more attention to their spiritual lives. It's such an interesting thing for a guy who has a PhD in clinical psychology from Harvard, has spent his life writing about the science of the brain and behavior. And ultimately, there's this very deep spiritual life there. And so I don't know, so again, I'm not trying to proselytize in any way, but I think it's a slightly stunted and limited life if all you're doing is operating in this very hyper-rational way that's just about this world. There's the poet Keats talked about the world of tin kettles. I have this image of in England, making tea out of these sort of battered tin kettles, and it's just a really nice image of kind of a regular, bland, boring, very pragmatic, very mundane life. And so for me, part of what I'm doing in reading something like the Zohar is getting out of this realm where I actually pretend that I understand. I don't really understand anything, and so just accepting our limitations, accepting the fact that ultimately life is extremely mysterious and we don't truly know, we don't understand ourselves, let alone other people. And we can't predict the future. And yet, as investors, we're having to position ourselves for an uncertain future. And that just requires a degree of humility. And so I think when I was judging Templeton in my youth, when I was probably 30 when I interviewed him, and I'm 53 now, I think I was looking at him thinking, we're so puerile, it's so childish to have this deep spiritual faith that he has. Like, just because you want it to be true doesn't mean it is. And I felt so sort of intellectually superior for having my sort of dogmatic view. And now I'm just like, I don't know. What do I know? I barely know how to tie my shoes. And so just to have a little bit, I'm friends with this guy, Bill Brewster, who has a very nice podcast. And I saw he posted something on Twitter the other day saying that he's realizing just how little he knows at this point. And I don't think he was just being humble. And I was saying to my mother recently, who lives in London, what I know for sure basically rounds to zero. And I wasn't being humble either. It's like really having this acceptance that, we know so little. And so, you're trying to maximize your odds of success in life by doing things that, on average, over time, a lot of work. And that's something that we really can clone from the greatest investors. But at the same time, to have the humility to say, what do I know? That's not a bad position to come from, because it keeps you humble enough to keep learning, I think. But maybe it's a better position to come from as a writer than as an investor. I don't know. An investor needs some degree of certitude, I think. For the greatest investors, they have a great deal of conviction, and at the same time, they're humble enough to know that they may be wrong. For a writer, I don't know. Maybe you need the same sort of thing. There's a kind of arrogance to being a writer where you're saying, this is what it means. This is what I think it means. But I don't know. I have a keener and keener sense of how little I really know.
That's amazing. As
That's my short answer.
No, but I've been paying attention seriously and taking notes. Do you think Berkshire Hathaway will be the same after Buffett and Munger are gone?
I don't see how it can be, but I mean, they're totally inimitable. Can you imagine all of us going every year
No.
to see Greg Abel and those guys?
No.
I don't think so, and that's not to be insulting to them in any way. Who knows? The stock may do better. The company may do even better, but no, it's got to change. But one of the things, and I own the stock, so I'm happy to keep owning it for many years. But so I'm biased anyway. But I think it has a remarkable culture. The culture is extraordinary, and the fact that they're not trying to take advantage of you, they're trying to make money with you, not off you. That's a very profoundly important thing. And I assume that the people they've hired are remarkable. I remember a few years ago being on the floor, the area where you go do all of the shopping. And, for me, it's usually that's where I go to buy coffee. Everyone else is buying, boats and stuff. And I'm just buying like a vat of coffee like this. But I remember a few years ago, I was there with Monish Pabrai and Guy Spear, and we're walking around and we're like, that's Greg Abel. And we sort of stop him and we're kind of chatting with him. And it couldn't have been nicer or more down to earth. And this is before they'd announced that he would be, Buffett's successor, I guess. But it was really striking. He's on his own, totally comfortable in his skin, not arrogant in any way. And so I don't know. I don't think that's a coincidence that they picked a guy like that, right? Who's not got a huge ego, but is obviously really smart and really capable. So I assume the culture is it'll change. But that culture of being rational, sensible, long-term, I assume that's going to last for a while.
Do you think that's one investment that everyone should make?
No, because we all have totally different situations and priorities.
Okay.
One of the reasons why I like it is, and I'm not by any means a great investor, so I'm ignore what I'm saying. But one of the reasons why I like it is that you're not paying a management fee, and so they're charging you nothing. So you're investing the float. So there's a structural advantage. And Buffett and Munger pay themselves $100,000 a year each to manage this enormous company. And so I have an episode of my podcast coming up with Tom Russo, who has an enormous, over $1 billion invested in the company. And he talks about this subject at some length. And the way he puts it is that it's the company with the least agency risk. There's nobody, usually there's this problem with any investment that there's an agent in there taking advantage of you in some way. And here's a culture where there's nobody taking advantage of you. That's an amazing thing. And this is one of the reasons also why I invested with Guy Spear so many years ago, is not because I thought, and again, I'm not saying this to be a shill for Guy, because he's a friend and I'm totally biased. But about half of the money in the fund was his family's money. And he has this fee structure that I'm in where there's no annual management fee. And I'm in a share class where there's a 5-year lockup, so I can't do anything. So I prevent myself from being stupid by not doing anything for 5 years. And he gets 15% of the profits over a 6% hurdle. So if he doesn't make a decent return, he literally will not get paid. And someone he works with said to him, Guy, you realize you might make no money for year after year after year. And he was like, yeah, welcome to the world of aligned incentives. And that to me is a very powerful thing. So Guy's not the most brilliant intellectually. I mean, he's a very, very smart guy, not the most brilliantly intellectual guy of all of the greatest investors I've met. I'm sure I could do better taking wild risk with someone else. I don't know. But to me, and I'm not saying this to be insulting to Guy, but to me, that's directionally correct. To be partnering with somebody who has skin in the game themselves, like serious skin in the game. His father's money, his mother's money, his aunt's money, his sister's money. It's all in there. And, big chunks of their money and the majority of everything that he has. So I'm not saying this as an advertisement to him. I'm saying this for your listeners. Think about agency risk. Think about what the person, whether the person you're investing with is looking out for your interests. And I think one of the best ways to judge it is just by their fee structure. You look at Berkshire Hathaway and you see that they've set it up so that they're making money with you, not off you. And that to me, that's so important, because if somebody is really aligned with me and they underperform, I'm like, well, at least they're going to suffer too. And at least they're putting their money where their mouth is. And if they underperform, I'm like, yeah, okay, I can take that. But if someone, I'm not really articulating this well, but if someone is a total snake and they gouge me, but they make me a lot of money, I don't know. I don't really want to partner with that person. I don't want them in my life. I'd rather have I remember Monish saying once to Guy, he didn't understand why Guy still owned Berkshire. He's like, you could make more money and other stuff. And Guy, this is many years ago, and Guy said, it's good for me to have it in my portfolio. Like, to have Warren and Charlie in my life is good for me. There's something anchoring about it. And I feel the same way. I feel when I look at my portfolio, I'm not saying it's the best ever, but I like the fact that Guy's in there. I like the fact that Warren and Charlie are in there. I have a couple of index funds. I like the fact that Jack Bogle is in there in a sense. Vanguard behaves honorably. And I think, the fact that, the Vanguard funds I own probably, 0.14 percentage points a year expenses. Then Berkshire, 0 expenses. And then Guy with his 0% a year fee structure. So I'm sort of thinking, there are very few things that we can control in life, but you can control the expenses. And if your annual expenses are too high, it's going to erode your returns. And so that's one thing I can control. I can also control living within my means and constantly adding to the pot. So like, I added to the pot last month when it got hit. And I added to the pot in March, April 2020. I bought Berkshire 2 or 3 times, as it was hit. And it's like, it's not the best investment. It's not the thing that's going to do best of everything, but it's probably directionally correct to keep adding during these periods where the market is hit. And it's over time, you'll probably do better if you keep living within your means. You keep adding to the pot. You don't overtrade. You try to push towards a 5-year holding period, a 10-year holding period, a 20. I mean, I've owned Guy's fund now for probably 21 years. Those index funds for over 20 years. The more I can push towards just being patient. So in a very short-term world where everyone else is getting more and more impatient, the more you can defer gratification, the more you can push your time horizon back. So you're like, I'm investing for 20 years from now, so I can handle the dips. I think that's a competitive advantage.
I'm sure you've compounded money and you've compounded goodwill. William, this has been a great interview. It's been already an hour and a half with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For your generosity, for your time. You had nothing to gain from this interview. It was just pure selfless and generosity. So really, really, we would like to thank you, Alejo.
Thank you.
Want to say something to
Yes,
William?
William, it was truly an honor, and I mean, answering me with my Twitter profile with a dog as a picture, 9 followers.
I
That's
like dogs a
really
great deal.
humbling of you. So it's been amazing, and we kind of jumped like you did when you received the Charlie news
Yeah,
that you
well,
were
that's
gonna.
that's
So
lovely
it's
to
an
hear.
honor.
Well, Alejandro, I got a message a few months ago. It's probably a year ago from some guys. I think they were in Vermont or something like that, and they were like, "We have a book group, and it's just 4 of us. Would you ever come talk to the book group?" And it's I went and chatted to their book group one evening. I spent basically the whole evening. I'm not saying this to be self-congratulatory, but I was like, who was really the recipient of the gift? It was me. Like I had a really nice evening, and I felt better about myself. And so this is one of the great paradoxes of compounding goodwill, of trying to be kinder and more generous, is the recipient turns out to be us. And so for me, you know, what could be better than to spend an evening with you guys? It's really lovely. And if it helps somebody in the audience, great. I hope, you know, and I hope they end up helping someone else. And it's like it's a really beautiful thing. And so that's a treat for me. Plus, I managed to avoid doing the Peloton this evening because I was chatting to you guys. So it's a double win.
Could we take a picture holding your book, William, the 3 of us?
Sure. Let me let me just take this off. All right. Let me put these on. There you go.
All right, 1, 2, 3. Awesome, man. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Hopefully, we'll have you in our channel for a second interview, William. Thank you.
That'll be a pleasure. It was a total delight. Thank you so much.
Great night.
Thank you, audience, for listening.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye. Bueno, pues ahí tienen. Qué entrevista más increíble, la verdad. Ni me la creo lo que acaba de pasar. 1:30 con semejante eminencia, con una persona que ha hablado con todos y todas las grandes mentes más brillantes del mundo de las inversiones. Alejo, ¿cómo la vio?
No, pues espectacular. Muchas gracias por invitarme y bueno, compartir con usted. Ha sido un honor y muy chévere, la verdad. Espectacular, la verdad.
Pues gracias a usted por lanzarse a escribirle el mensaje al hombre y bueno, uno se lleva sorpresas en la vida. Esperemos que un par a los que les hemos escrito ahí en frío nos contesten, ¿por qué no? Por ahí les tendremos sorpresas el día que nos contesten y seguiremos trayendo grandes invitados. Alejo, feliz noche, muchas gracias por acompañarme.
Chao, Juan.
Chao, papá. Bueno, pues muchas gracias por conectarse, gracias a todos, una entrevista espectacular. Mañana mismo la publicaremos con subtítulos en español. Yo estuve tomando un montón de notas, espero recoger todas estas experiencias y estas lecciones de los grandes inversionistas del planeta. Un abrazo enorme, muchas gracias y como siempre decimos acá, a seguir aprendiendo. Nos vemos en una próxima oportunidad. Chao, chao.